Hello everybody, my name is Nubed and welcome back to another Borderlands 4 Amon build video, and today we're going over my Storm God Amon build. This build has been something I've been working on for quite a while now, but just waiting on the blackout fix that happened last week because that was going to be a big part of it, and much to my non-surprise, everything is working really well, and this build is one of the most fun builds I've made so far. Before I get into things, also want to give a shout out to my buddies Girthquake and Ancient Rune, who've also done similar builds like this. I'll link their channels in the description down below if you want to check out their spin on it. But fundamentally, this build is fully focused on the Stormlance augment as for Amon, which gives him the ability to throw out spears, which is just a very fun idea in general. And it also works really well because we are leveraging class mods like the Shadowrite, which gives us melee damage, which lets us synergize from a whole lot more skills that Amon has access to. So without any further ado, we'll get straight cracking into this. Okay, and now for the skill tree breakdown. So we'll start with the Vengeance skill tree, and like this video and this build is focused around, it's heavily focused around the Stormlance augment, which basically turns your default forge waves into throwable lightning spears, which deal ordnance damage on impact, and they can also prime enemies as well, which increases in detonation damage. Now this build isn't fully focused on the detonation damage, but it can be leveraged for some little extra AoE clearing and also boss damage as well. But it's going to be hard to do that because our forge skill ability is the default firewall shield, and we don't have enough points to pick up something that's a bit more usable. So you're not really going to be able to prime or detonate bosses that have been primed because it's just hard to place a shield on those bosses during the fights. However, this is more for a mobbing scenario where these forge spears are going to be useful when it comes to detonation. But nonetheless, the damage of these forge waves is more than enough to kill bosses anyway, as you can tell by the clips in the start of this video. So from a tier 1 perspective, we have Wrath of Nature, and the reason why we picked this up is because we want that status effect application chance increases. Because we have a few skills in the Calamity tree that increase our dot damage, dot chance, and spreading dots as much as we can, which we'll talk about soon, we want to try and increase the stat where we can. We also pick up Scorched Kairos, and this is for ordnance damage. We don't really care about the magazine size bonus. The ordnance damage is what matters, and this is because our Stormlance does ordnance damage. So when we try and think of ways to increase the damage that we can for our builds, like I was talking about in my other skill tree breakdown videos, when you're making builds, you want to try and add as many scalings as possible and boost those things where possible. So we pick up ordnance damage through Scorched Kairos to increase the ordnance damage of our Stormlances. We then have Tail of the Comet. This is an incredibly powerful skill, scales at any sort of dot or status effect chance and status effect damage skills, and yeah, incredibly powerful skill. And because we're going to be dealing a bunch of damage initially, as soon as you get a proc using the ordnance damage from the Stormlances, our damage increases massively. So that's it for the branch. We only have 3 skills because the points are spent a lot in the red tree to increase the damage. Then we have Blackout. Now this skill was bugged up until last week, which has now been fixed and now works as intended. So what Blackout does is that when it gives your ordnance damage a chance to critically hit, which once again, our Stormlances do ordnance damage, so we're giving it the chance to crit, and when it does crit, these deal direct ordnance damage and it deals shock, and it's 75% off the damage you deal per second. Now 50% chance might not seem like a whole lot, but when we also factor in things like our specializations and so on, that helps to increase the chances that we have of critting and increasing our damage overall. So that's it for the Vengeance skill tree, and then we move on to the Calamity tree, and there's a lot more points invested into here. We start with Discombobulate, which gives us melee critical hit chance. Now, you may be thinking, looking at the item card for the Stormlance, that this is just shock ordnance damage. However, from a gear perspective, we use a Shadowrite com, which gives our forge waves the ability to scale with melee damage as well. So now, by picking up Discombobulate, we're giving our Stormlances the ability to crit with their melee damage as well, which is really handy for extra damage. We then pick up Wield the Storm. Pretty obvious, like I was saying before, this build, especially around the bossing aspect of it, is built heavily around status effect damage and status effect duration to make sure our dots last longer, dealing extra damage. So Wield the Storm is pretty much a no-brainer pick here. We then have 5 points in Tritanium Knuckles to increase our melee damage and our skill damage. Once again, don't really need to explain much about this. These scale both with the Stormlance abilities, so we pick this. We then have a single point in Gut Punch. Now, it's up to you whether you want to take a couple points out of Tritanium Knuckles and sink it into Gut Punch, for example. Alternatively, I do have a couple burner points here. For example, I have a point in Bloodlust, so you can take this point out and put it in Gut Punch to increase your chances. Personally, from my experience with bossing and mobbing, it doesn't really need to be maxed out completely, but once again, completely up to you as to what you want to do with that. And to move further down the tree, we also pick up the best defense, but this is also a bit of a point you could sink into Gut Punch if you so choose. So you can have 3 out of 3 Gut Punch, but you just give up best defense and Bloodlust, but once again, entirely up to you. The reason why we pick up the best defense is because we're dealing a lot of melee damage with our Stormlances or our Eternal Winter Forgeries, depending on what you choose. And because we've got to be dealing a bunch of damage, we get a bunch of overshield as a result. Even a single point gives us a lot of overshield, which helps with survivability. So yeah, but up to you. You can take these points out of best defense and Bloodlust and stick it in Gut Punch if you want. And now we get into the real meat of this build, outside of Blackout in this the Vengeance tree. These few skills that we have here help a lot to increase the damage that we deal overall, especially when it comes to our damage over time ticks. So we pick up Catastrophe and max it out. What Catastrophe does is that whenever Amon applies shock to an enemy, you gain increased critical hit chance, and whenever Amon applies burning to an enemy, you gain increased critical hit damage. Now both of these stack separately and it lasts for 12 seconds, and it can stack up to 3 stacks, which is very useful. Now the reason why this gets even better is because we have Electrical Fire, which gives Amon the ability to, whenever he burns an enemy, he shocks them, and whenever you shock an enemy, you burn them. What this does is, well, one, you get the increased damage over time from both of these abilities, but you get the bonuses from Catastrophe as well. So even if you're only using a shock-based weapon to get your critical hit chance, for example, Electrical Fire will also apply a burn dot to an enemy, which gives you critical hit damage, which in turn feeds into the dots and feeds into your overall damage from your Stormlances and any other things that you choose to use, if you choose to use guns for this build. We then have 3 points in Crackling Aegis. This gives Amon increased status effect damage and ordnance damage based on his shields, and the fuller the shield, the greater the effect. Now this changes a little bit when using something like the Protean Self or bossing, and because the whole point of that shield is that it drains your shields, you do get a little bit less damage out of this skill. It's better, at least from an optimal damage perspective, rather than putting points into something like Fist of Stone, for example, or Dragon's Breath, because this doesn't apply to Stormlance. This is just a little bit of a free damage boost. So yeah. You then have 2 points of Judgment. This is once again a burner point because we need to get down to Electrical Fire anyway. 2 points in Dragon's Breath isn't super useful for this specific Stormlance build because we're not using guns, but this helps just from a mobbing situation and also to bosses as well, which is pretty useful. And then we already talked about Electrical Fire, so that's pretty much that for this. Now, in terms of the weapons, we don't care about weapons, so use whatever you want. However, for bossing, I do suggest a weapon that has an underbarrel that increases damage taken, so I used the Whiskey Foxtrot with a scrap cannon. I do know there's some weapons that have a toxic vial launcher underbarrel, which also increases the damage taken for enemies, so you can use that as well. So yeah, just pick your poison and just do whatever you can from an underbarrel perspective to make the enemy take a bit more increased damage. But from a from a mobbing perspective, you don't need weapons at all, so obviously there's nothing equipped here. From a rep kit perspective, no surprises here. We have the triple bypass. This is because it works really well with the specialization now with caffeine, which we'll talk about shortly. But yeah, just helps to keep our active skill up as much as we can. Now from a roll perspective, while I do have the hard hitter part on my triple bypass, you can also use the elemental damage bonus part for this triple bypass because it helps to increase your overall damage output. And you also have the option to use the action skill cooldown rate one as well. While this isn't going to increase your damage directly, it'll help you get your action skill a lot quicker. From my testing, if you don't have this and you do have now with caffeine, it takes about 3 rep kits to get your action skill back up and running. However, if you equip the action skill cooldown roll, you only have to use 2 rep kits. So it does help to loop that a lot more smoother. If you're looking at the background gameplay, which I'll show at some point, you can see that there are moments in gameplay where it stalls out a little bit while I'm waiting for it to come back off cooldown, but this action skill cooldown rate roll basically negates that completely. However, from an optimal damage perspective, highly suggest the elemental roll on it, but melee damage also works, just not as optimally. In terms of the firmware, Action Fist is what we want. In an ideal world, we have 2 points of Real Big Fist and 2 points in Action Fist. However, I haven't been so lucky with my gear rolls just yet, so I don't have action skill damage on this. But nonetheless, the damage you're seeing in the bossing clips at the start of this video just shows that this build can kick some ass anyway, so you don't need to worry too much about that. From like an ordnance perspective, once again, no surprises here. Amon and Slippy have become best friends since day one, and this doesn't change at all. The reason why we have this is because one, it does ordnance damage and it does melee damage, so it just helps to increase the damage output, scales with all the other things that we're boosting anyway. So yeah, don't need to explain much about that. From a class mod perspective, we have the Shadowrite class mod. Now, like I was saying before, this is what gives our Stormlance and our Eternal Winter Forgeways a lot more extra soup and scaling with the melee damage. So what this class mod does is that you now basically deal melee damage in addition to ordnance damage and actual damage and all those sorts of things as well. So it helps from a damage increase perspective. In terms of the skill rolls, right now I have 4 points in Berserk and 2 points in Age of Ice. What I do suggest though from a bossing perspective is as many points into Age of Ice as possible, which is the second skill that you can see on here. While Berserk is nice, the damage bonus you get out of this isn't super high and not really applicable as much in terms of bossing, mainly because we're not spamming our forge skills. Because we're not doing that, we don't really get the bonus out of this as much as we could. However, Age of Ice is just a flat damage increase to bosses and frozen enemies. If I was to go back here, the boss damage part of it is always active, so by maxing out your points in Age of Ice, you're always going to have just extra boss damage for free basically without investing too much more into it. In terms of the rolls, cry damage and elemental damage are what you want. Cry damage, I believe, is just the default roll in this, and elemental damage just helps with that soup, ties in nicely if you also have elemental damage on your rep kit as well. From a shield perspective, this changes a little bit depending on the situation. So for any mobbing scenario, I like to use the heavyweight. It's very fun to use and it just feels like you're doing a whole lot more melee damage as well, and very punchy. You can, as in some background gameplay, see me just one-shotting enemies randomly here and there, which is really, really useful. We then have the enhancement here. Once again, doesn't really help for what we're trying to do. So realistically, this is just a firmware slave, and I just have a point and real big fist here just to give us those extra bonuses that we can get from maxing out the set bonuses. So yeah, that's the enhancement. And back to the shield, actually, I forgot to mention. So for mobbing, I suggest using the heavyweight shield, but when it comes to bossing, I highly suggest the Protean Cell shield. Now, while this does make you a little bit weaker in a boss fight, mainly because the shield just drains your health, or drains your shield, it does give you a significant amount of bonus shock damage, which applies to all your damage sources. So this means that any sort of dot damage, melee damage, ordnance damage, all gets bonus shock damage, which scales massively. So at the start of this video, when I was showing those boss kills, you can see how quickly they're melted, and that's because of this. So by adding extra shock damage, we're also tying that into things like electrical fire and catastrophe to increase the amount of damage that we deal and get the bonuses out of catastrophe as well. So those are the gears out of the way. In terms of specializations, similar to my Hammerfall build, but also dissimilar in some instances. So we start with fragmentation payload. So because our Stormlance is ordnance damage, we want to try and boost this where we can. So fragmentation payload gives our ordnance a chance to crit, and when we do, we gain increased ordnance crit hit damage as well. Once again, just adds to the overall soup or damage that we have. We also have a Hone Mind. Because Stormlance is an action skill, we also can add this to give it more chances to crit. The moral of the story here is that whenever we can get something to crit, we take it because that increases the damage that we can do. We then have the best defense. This is more of a survivability skill, and because we're going to be having a couple overshield skills, when I say couple, we have a single one in the form of the best defense here. We get overshield, which means that we can keep our health up a bit more. So this adds extra damage because our health is going to be trying topped up as much as we can. 30% when full. While it's not a huge number, it still adds up, and every bit counts when you're trying to optimize a build. We then have Now with Caffeine finally, and this skill helps to loop that Stormlance active skill very nicely. So what this does is whenever you use your rep kit, you reduce your active skill cooldown. And the benefit of the triple bypass is that it has 3 charges by default, which is good, but also every time you use it, you get a 30% chance to replenish charge on kill. So you spam it, get some kills, and you get some more triple bypasses, spam that a bit more, and you can loop that and get your Stormlance back up and running as much as possible. So yeah, that's pretty much the build in a nutshell. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. I also have a Discord linked if you want to jump in and talk about some Amon builds, a bunch of other Amon theory crafters as well. The link will be in the description down below. But yeah, hope you guys enjoy this build, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.